Hello, Isaac.
Hello, Rabbi. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Very exciting that we're getting into some formative Christian persecution and text. Uh,
I'm intrigued. I'm so looking forward to bring thoughts on this. This verse to me seems loaded on multiple levels. So it's not as allegorical as some of the other verses read so far in the Sermon on the Mount. Anyway, but let's
so,
get
so
started.
what you're
The
noting.
Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 5, verse 11.
No, 1 second. So what you're noting is that why a lot of while only Saint Augustine really says the eighth of the Beatitudes is not part of the Beatitude, I think there's a more high level of consensus that feels so different from the rest of the Beatitudes that this feels like this was a later edition. But all these things open Pandora's boxes. Like I've never studied the way that Matthew was edited and what could have been added before after. And I think I always tell you that I take the attitude, this is what we got. Let's try to figure out how it got here. But this should be represented. I have no problem to say this was added later, but it became part of the Matthean community for this attitude. So let's see what this says.
The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 5, verse 11. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
Okay, and while we're probably not going to do verse 12, it definitely feels like that is one long sentence. So I appreciate you reading the whole thing. The reason that this would be one of the Beatitudes because it starts blessed. It's really hard to think that someone who's adding something would start the same exact way unless it was there before. But we do talk about persecution before, right? This is not the first time. The verse right before talks about persecution. If anything, this expands upon that. So let's start by taking account your feelings on this. What do you notice are differences? How do you feel about this verse? Is it inherently different from the rest of the Beatitudes?
It feels like it's different, but to your point, it also feels like this expands on verse 10, verse 10 is being rephrased using different words, using a few changes. As a persecution here, as in when you're being reviled and persecuted and speak all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account, which to me in some ways feels like it's verse 10 all over again, but a bit more nuanced. And
what's really interesting about what you're saying is that almost everything about verse 10 exists elsewhere. So for example, blessed elsewhere. Blessed shows up in every verse of the Beatitude. Persecuted shows up in verse 11. Righteousness shows up in verse 6. For someone's sake shows up in verse 11. So it's really interesting that if you kind of paste different pieces, you could probably reconstruct verse 10. But what we also see is that specifically there are different elements of verse 10 that appear, not only do they appear elsewhere, but it's unclear how the relationship of 10 to 11 is in general. When you look at verse 11, the most dominant thing that I think is very different is that all the Beatitudes are in third person, now we're in second person. If you look at Luke's Sermon on the Plain, they're all in the second person. And when I showed you the verses in Deuteronomy, which I thought were very similar, the blessings and cursings that took place on Mount Gerizim, what we see is that blessed are you who come, blessed are you. So we do see them in second person. So I think we do have to account why there's this transition. It doesn't mean that all the Beatitudes have to be all in third person, all in second person. There's nothing wrong with someone deciding to change from a poetic perspective from third to second. And I think that we could very easily account for it here, but I think the most noteworthy point that Luke all second person, Matthew all third person, except for this verse, and the next verse we go to you and your reward and your feelings and how you were persecuted. Okay, so that's a really important element.
Yeah, and so do you have any thoughts as to why this is the second person in Matthew versus all the other?
I do. So to answer that, I think let's just look at one part of the verse. What another structural element that's inherently different about this is that there's almost like a list of things. it's not that you're going to be meek or you're going to mourn or you're going to comfort. The only one where we even have like a list of things is hunger and thirst, which you really can feel that is one concept. But over here in verse 11, we have that people are going to revile you. They're going to hate you.
What do you
And then
mean by revile?
they
What's
hate.
been
One second, I have another translation. And if you don't like revile, because maybe you
it? It
revile.
it kind of revile and persecute. I mean, in terms of the exact difference, I mean, it feels like it's at least in.
They're not synonyms. So revile usually means to reproach. Oh, sorry. We have another translation that says it means reproach you, which is not revile. I always interpreted revile. I always thought it was more like it just means to hate someone through criticism. So it's like a very strong form of reproach, angrily insult. So anyway, what's interesting though, as opposed to all the beatitudes before, in my humble opinion, there seems to be a progression here, right? Imagine you hate someone. Isaac finds a random person in the street. He hates how that person dresses. He hates how that person smells. He hates how the person talks. So how does Isaac, not you, Isaac the evil, how does Isaac the evil respond to this person? First, he probably takes note, but after he takes note, he has the feelings of anger. He starts reviling. He starts criticizing. He starts reproaching. Starts saying like, "This is not the way to be. You're horrible." But what happens after that? That doesn't work. What are you going to do after that? Number two, you're going to start persecuting. You're going to say, "I'm going to make sure you don't get a job. I'm going to make sure your friends hate you." That's way past reproaching. And the third thing that we are going to see is that after I do that, and I see that fails, I'm going to try to speak everything, all the lies I can against you in order to destroy the whole world around you. I wasn't able to change you internally by going one-on-one, have this unilateral relationship. I wasn't able to change you by expanding that unilateral relationship to your situation around you and persecuting. And then I expanded a third level to be able to talk lies about you. Because if I say a lie to you, Isaac, that's meaningless. Obviously, the lies are to a third party and a fourth party. So I view this as a progression that very much what we would have expected a new religion that Christianity would have gone through. There would have been these psychological attacks on Christianity, and this is what we know was the case. That at the end of the first century, there wasn't as much martyrdom. You know, martyrdom started a little bit later, but the main thing that we'll find, at least in the Gospels specifically, was, as we mentioned before, the kind of sticks and stones kind of attitude. And this is what we see here. The persecution I'm maintaining, I'm arguing that is the second stage. You can imagine persecution being a third stage where like, oh, and I cut your arm off. So I don't think persecution means the kind of militant, bellicose, damaging, destructive nature. I think it's meant to be, I'm trying to hurt you. I'm trying to make sure that you can't thrive. That's a good way to say it.
Thank you for the progression. So, but all this is contingent upon only one thing, on falsely on my account. It's because of something they know or something they do. It's something in relation. But even before we go there, right? Even before we go there, right? Is there does this verse have a basis in the Torah and or in the Old Testament, right? So, for this, because all the other verses they have a basis in the Torah.
So I don't know. I mean, we do see that this parallels Luke 6:22, but what I can't think of any verse that shows this progression. But I did want to point out that there is this kind of idea, specifically by the Egyptians, when the Israelites came into Egypt, specifically Jacob's sons. But we see there's this progression that they start off as part of like the king's royal entourage. Joseph, they start being hated. They start being a threat. There's this verse in Exodus that says, "Let us deal wisely of them before they come and rise up against us, not themselves by joining another army," because they're always viewed as the other. And therefore, the persecution and the enslaved people all are consequences of the attitudes that people had towards them. And we see this progression by Egypt. So I thought it was really interesting that you could see that this is always kind of coming from, there's the Christian who is the other, and then there's the general population who's always going to view the Christian as the other, and it shows the progression not about what the Christian is going to feel, but what is going to be inflicted upon him by the general population. So I do think that parallels the Egypt. Is there a verse in Isaiah or Psalms like we've seen before? I'm sure we can find parallels to any individual word, but I can't think of like something that's a form progression. But I do think this answers are switch from third person to second person. I think we keep talking about what are the beatitudes, and I view it as kind of like the stake in the ground for the foundation of Christianity, that we're really dealing with a different kind of attitude towards the kingdom of heaven, towards what a
Hmm.
person should be, towards kind of having a subversive kind of reality that is both within Judaism and somewhat external to Judaism. But I think this verse now it is different inherently from the others in that it definitely talking about blessed, but it's now not going to talk about an attitude, something that someone's going to have. It's not telling you because you're persecuted, you're going to see the world differently. That was already said in verse 10. It's going to say now, by the way, you are going to get a different attitude. You're going to have different feelings because of the life you're going to live because you're Christian. There's going to be persecution. There's going to be reproach. There's going to be reviling. There's going to be hatred. And, we could argue about why it doesn't say martyrdom. What's really interesting when you compare this to Luke, there is one extra phrase in Luke. And if you look, it says, which exclude them. Another way to say it is excommunication. If you wanted to, we could spend days talking about rabbinic attitudes towards excommunication. It was totally a norm in that time period that Jews would excommunicate other Jews when they are felt to be outside the normative limits of the theology. So if anything, it just makes Luke feel a little bit later. Once Christians kind of were breaking up, they eventually started their communities started to get excommunicated by Jews. And I think this would have been the fact that it's in Luke and not in Matthew just shows that Matthew's a little bit earlier. And again, if Luke was a little later, it would have said, and martyred left and right. It just shows the kind of persecution that the Christians were feeling in different time periods. For example, if you said that someone was put on a stake
Hmm.
and was crucified, you'd kind of be able to date that a little bit different than if you say someone had a guillotine.
Hmm.
You would recognize the historical differences. So I think you could recognize certain historical differences in attitude towards the other that we're experiencing in Luke versus Matthew.
Well, thank you for that parallel. Is it possible the blessed here, it's not because they're being persecuted, but because they're persecuted, they acquire the attitude, they would acquire the attitude of being poor in spirit, or of being meek, or of being humble, that they would mourn. And it's because of the relation to it's because how being persecuted puts a person in the position to to acquire the attitudes in verses 3 onwards. That's reason, that's why this is blessed. That's a blessing.
Well, that's the way I view verse 10. I think like what you're saying, I think is true, but I feel like that was the attitude of being blessed because uh, the Beatitudes are you're blessed or you're enriched or you're content, whatever the first word means, because your attitude is different than you are the other, because your attitude is different from the rest of the population. Anyone who had economic success, anyone who had no death, anyone who didn't have the trials and tribulations of life is not what we're talking about, because those people are already acclimated to a kingdom of earth and they don't need the kingdom of heaven. So I would say what you're saying is true, but for verse 10, I see verse 11 as a further step. And I think it's, if anything, it's a good question. When we talk about Jesus, are we talking about him as like, do you view Jesus as a prophet? Would you say that, like, that he tells the future in a context?
Well,
So
he's a Messiah. Now is he a prophet? I mean, um, it's
well, I
he's not
think
exclusive.
the
He's not
difference is this verse. So
yeah.
if you view him as a prophet who's just like a fortune teller who can tell the future, then you can read this verse as just Jesus, just like all the biblical prophets are, these kind of like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Samuel, like this is going to happen. So if you view Jesus as the kind of prophet or Messiah who's going to tell you what's going to happen, then this verse could be like, by the way, Christians, ready yourselves. But if you
Right.
view Jesus as just a Messiah who's meant to kind of bring the kingdom of earth to heaven and perform miracles now, but not necessarily tell the future, he's saying that more like what you're saying in verse 10, these are kind of negative things that happen and it changes you. Or if you don't experience persecution, you are changed. I think it's such an interesting point. I think that it's not that the kingdom of heaven is trying to change you to accept the kingdom of heaven. I think there's this idea that you kind of start with all these evils, and then because you get acclimated to normative economic success in society, you kind of walk away from what the kingdom of heaven would want from you. The idea of everyone kind of sharing or everyone kind of having this like really positive attitude towards one another, or the
Mhm.
fact that you're like these are almost viewed as like naive or juvenile things that are inaccessible to people who are weathered by the normal ups and downs, the vicissitudes of life. And so it's interesting if you imagine it as like a step up or a going back down to what you should have been in the first place. It's like, it's interesting when you try to think of what the kingdom of heaven is. When you think of the poor in spirit, it's because he has not acclimated to the intellectual superiority of these crazy metaphysicians who are making up stuff. Right, he will have better access to the knowledge. It's almost like this simplistic, I don't want to say like, this simplistic, naive kind of attitude that is being deemed superior. Anyway, it's just interesting to think about that as an additional concept about what the kingdom of heaven really is.
So when the initial audience, when they heard this,
they're like, "What's happening? Where am I? I don't get
it." Yeah. So because earlier,
stand up, Jesus. That's what they said. Stand up.
Yeah. So earlier, right, we spoke about the kingdom of God has been ushered in. That's from chapter 4, verse 23 onwards. And now he's speaking about suffering. He's speaking about this poverty and persecution, which would have been quite jarring, I would say, for people who are expecting him to be the Messiah and things connected with being a Messiah. So
I mean, this verse, like you're saying, it is connected to the Messiah, and this verse feels a little bit like, it does feel a little later. When you look at Luke, it specifically says, on account of the Son of Man. When you look at Matthew, on my account, on Jesus' account. So it makes it sound. Yeah, sorry.
What does he mean on my account?
Okay, so that's our next topic. So generally, when you say on my account, it means because of me. Because of me means that it's a really deep concept. In Hebrew, this is, I have some Jewish text for you on this line. When you think of, why did you drink that coffee or tea? Why did you drink that right now? What's the reason?
Because I'm thirsty. I need something to drink.
So on account of you being thirsty, right?
Yeah.
But you didn't make yourself thirsty. Biology made you thirsty. Maybe evolution caused that. Maybe God caused that. So a lot of times when you look,
I wouldn't say God caused. It's just
God upheld the world that allowed you to be thirsty. If God doesn't uphold the world, you're not thirsty. So my point is that when you look for the cause of something, there's the direct cause and the indirect cause. So for example, if I say, Isaac, you have to be a good Muslim, you have to give a certain amount of charity. So you might give charity because you think you should help the poor. You might give charity because you want to be a good person. You might give charity because you want to get into heaven. You might give charity because you want to ingratiate yourself to Muhammad and Allah. So there'd be a lot of reasons why, as a Muslim, you give charity. But if I say to you, Isaac the Muslim, why are you giving charity? I think that for you to say, it might be all those reasons. So when we talk about something because of something or for your sake, it's a very complicated concept because it's not always clear the direct line of what for your sake. There's this concept in Judaism called lishma, for its name, for its sake. And I'll tell you two rabbinic texts, which I think will shed light on this idea. One, I know by heart because I've said it 1,000 times. I only know in English. It says, whenever you do something not for its own sake, for an ulterior motive, let's say that means, eventually it'll inculcate you in the values that you need, and you'll do it for its own sake. So the Hebrew phrase is lo lishma ba lishma. You do it for the wrong reasons, you'll come to do it for the right reasons. In other words, using like when I want to get married because I want to have sex, but I don't want a family. I want to give charity. I want to give charity because I want to make sure that my name gets on a building, but I don't care about poor people. I want to feed my body because I'm a hedonist glutton, but not because I'm thirsty, not because. So you could always have these wrong reasons. So Judaism at least says, do it for the wrong reason. Start there, get it, build your immune system, build up your rote attitude, and you'll do it for the reason. But then people wonder, if you do it for the wrong reason forever, so you die, and you never got that. Like, did you actually do anything? When we say do it for the wrong reason, is that really the command? Is that really being a good person, or is that just really pedagogical, preparatory, educational to get you next level? So when we so that's one rabbinic text, and I think it really we'll do the second one in a second, but it really I think lends itself to like this conversation over here in 11 when it says you do it on my account. So what does my account mean? When it says and again in Luke it says on account of the Son of Man, is it because you're a believer in Jesus? You're a believer he's the Messiah. You're a believer in God. You're a believer in that there's a kingdom of heaven. When you say on my account, it can mean so many different things. And I think there's this idea of lo lishma, you're doing it for the wrong reason, you get the right reason. It could be you do it on his account at the highest level, means that you're not doing it with any ulterior motives. So if you get persecuted, reviled, reproached, and or just people speak falsely about you, you might do that because you're a bad person. People don't like you. But if that's happening specifically only because when another person looks at you, they see Jesus' reflection in you. You are a representative of Jesus on earth because you are such a believer, such doing it for his own sake. Then he's saying that's the kind of person who's being blessed in, I just closed it. I turned the page. That was dumb. To be blessed in this situation. So I think that when we understand what it means to do something for his own sake, that is specifically what Jesus is doing. And again, like I want to argue that all the Beatitudes, there's a purity to them. It's meant to be like the most enlightened version of the situation. It's blessed are the poor in spirit, for their kingdom. Who else? There's a million other people who you could say are the kingdom of heaven. Not only that, we even see in verse 10, there's another group that kingdom of heaven. But with the poor in spirit in the Jesus' Beatitudes is the most refined version of that teaching. It is the teaching. The people who are, who else is kingdom of heaven? I don't know. People who do commandments, people who are nice. No. There's a million people who might get the kingdom of heaven. But let me tell you, the poor in spirit is the best example, or if you're Luke, the poor. So I view all these examples as the best example. And so only if you use the best example can you say you're doing something lishma, for its own sake. And therefore, unless the person is able to say that I'm reviled because of Jesus, and not reviled because I'm also ugly, but I believe in Jesus, it has to be I'm reviled because of that. And almost no one ever is. You're almost never, like even the greatest Catholic, even the Pope. Does anyone really look at the Pope and go, that's 100% God? They say, there's that Latin spirit in him still. They'll say that like, he does these things and like he tries to speak from the seat of St. Peter, but when he does it, he does. When he doesn't, like, there's never this purity of like he's really representing God, or at least from the way I perceive Catholics. I don't know what's really happening in Rome. So I feel like that when we speak of this verse, there's the idea that you have to literally be persecuted for his sake. Now, let me give you one more example. And I think it's a really good example. This is from the Talmud, Tanit 7a. Whoever studies or occupies himself with Torah, the learning of Torah, for its own sake, whatever that means here, saying that, his learning becomes an elixir of life for him. But whoever occupies himself with Torah not for its own sake, it becomes to him a deadly poison. So what we see is that you could do the best thing in the world. You could literally be a person who learns Torah all day, but you do it lo lishma, not for its own sake, whatever that means, we could discuss, then it's a deadly poison because you're using it, you're misusing it. That's a good way to say it. So Jesus is saying, if you're reviled, reproached, hated, persecuted because of me, that's the one-way ticket to heaven and the kingdom of heaven. But if you're reviled for other reasons, it's meaningless. It's not. Don't look at me and say I'm reviled, reproached, unless you're willing to put that mantle of Christianity on and say I am Jesus is representative on earth. So that's why I feel, in my humble opinion, this is still living up to the Beatitudes attitude of being a refined message of a fundamental idea. The fact that it switches to the second person, it's actually speaking to this is a person you have to be. It's when it says poor in spirit, that's a concept. I would say no one could really be poor in spirit at the level that Jesus is talking about. No one could be meek, but you can be persecuted and you can be reviled. You can be reproached and you could be lied about at the level Jesus is talking about it. But he's saying if you experience that in the second person, you Isaac over there sitting there in Washington Heights or wherever in Manhattan, it's important for you to, if you get that, but you should know you can only say you represent me if it's lishma, if it's for its own sake.
That's true. That is wow. Now it's a lot to process. It's a lot to think, well, thank you for the distinction, right? So when we started with falsely on my account, I was reminded of a conversation on Job, as in the devil, the persecution can only come as much as God allows for this, right? Or God defines the boundaries, and nothing can come inside, or any boundary is
I love how
boundary.
you're taking the positive. Like everyone always looks at the situation of God and say that was so unjustified, that was mean, that was horrible. And you're like on the other side. No, he could have. The devil could have done worse. God stopped it. You're being much more positive and optimistic.
Yeah,
About God's attitude.
I think.
Yeah,
because I think that's my takeaway from a conversation where God defines his boundary, right? And so in the context of that, what I'm hearing you say is that each of these difficulties or persecution or whatever, as long as if they're being, if they're part of, if if they're because of a person's faith or a person's attitude or a person's relationship to the word, to God, to Jesus, then in that case it puts them on a different pedestal or puts them on a different place. As you said, it's a one-way ticket to
You
the
hear that?
kingdom
So
of God.
the greatest commandment in Judaism, according to everyone, is to learn Torah. So learn the Bible. And what it says is, if you learn the Bible 24/7 in that line from the Talmud, but you do it for the wrong reason, it's
Wrong.
poison. Poison. That's like, can you imagine? It's killing you every second that you think you're doing a commandment. You think you're serving God, you're poisoning yourself. I think that teaching very much parallels this kind of attitude of the Beatitudes. That what you think you're doing, the people who think that they're getting rich and they're not, and they're trying to build themselves up in order to serve God. Jesus is saying, like, you don't need that. You need to kind of extricate yourselves from the norms of what you think is the way to serve.
Yeah, no. So much of this, right? Would these teachings have come across as being absurd to the initial communities? Like, would they have understood this when Jesus?
This would have been the clearest one, 511. I know what persecution, I know what people lying. Like, when you hear someone, what is the most common thing people do? Talk smack, right? So when you finally have, like, oh, they're talking bad about us, that would have been like this. I think this one would have resonated the most.
Yeah, but then in the earlier passage, Jesus healed people. It speaks in chapter 4, verse 23 onwards. It spoke as to how he healed them. All those who were afflicted were
Well,
made whole, right?
these people
And
are also
so,
getting rewards, though. It's not like these people aren't made, like, those people getting miracles, and these people in the next verse get heaven. So these people are still getting gladness and reward. So I don't think it's so different that you're still getting the compensation, right? For example, if it said 511 and not 512, we would have been like, that's lishma. They do it because they have to do it. But 512 kind of, like, again, it always undermines. Whenever you give reward, it undermines a little.
okay, now play the devil's advocate, right? Now, 511 would fit the Pharisees so well. If Jesus looked at one group with contempt, they were the Pharisees. If he looked at one group with anger, it were the Pharisees, right? And all they did was they held they held the word so strongly, or that, or he quotes them in such demeaning ways, as in,
I
don't be
feel
like
like
them.
it's a great question. Like, I don't personally agree with what you're saying. I think the reason Pharisee is like a bad word today is because of what happens in the New Testament. But I would say the group that's most hated or felt to be most off the path by Jesus is the multitudes. I think those.
Wow, that's interesting. Okay, could
I
you
think
expand
I
more? I
think
would have.
Jesus identified. I remember I told you like last week or like earlier session that there's the cool kids and the not cool kids. I think Jesus identifies not with the cool kids, with the kids that would be more the losers in school. The Pharisees are just another group, a group of cool kids, just like the Sadducees and people in Jerusalem. But I
Uh-huh.
think the problem is that the multitudes are all off. That what we call hamona'am, the masses, are so led astray, maybe by the Pharisees or by the Romans or whatever, but the multitudes are so off. He's coming to like undermine. I don't feel he's coming to undermine the Pharisees. He disagrees with the Pharisees, but he's come to undermine the attitude that the multitudes have towards the universe. It could be like the Pharisees are the ones who are leading the Jews, but I think when you say like the first beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, that's not anti-Pharisee. That's anti-everyone. When you look at blessed are those who mourn, that's not anti-Pharisee. That's anti-everyone. He's identifying with the other over and over again. That's how I see
Okay.
it. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's great. No, thank you. So I've usually viewed Jesus as being, or the one group he was so opposed with the Pharisees, where he quotes them as in, don't be like that. If you be like them, you're not going to go anywhere. You've got to do this, got to do that. And so now all they were doing, all the Pharisees were doing at that time, is they were trying to uphold the law as they have known it, the commandments as they have known it. And so, like when this was said, blessed are you when others revile you, persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you on my account, blah, blah, blah. This could have been used as in, or they could have felt it too, right? So here we are trying to hold the law and do the law as we've learned from our forefathers, and here comes this person called Jesus, whoever he is, and we feel persecuted because of what he says against us. But I'll have to think about what you're saying, where you're saying the one group or the group which Jesus
Well,
undermined. Well,
maybe you look at it this way. It'll help you. If you go to like a small town in Tennessee,
yeah,
and you'll have two kinds of Baptists there, right? Just pick your favorite town in Tennessee.
Yeah.
and the churches are on the same street, and they view each other as heretics. Two kinds of Baptists.
Uh-huh.
They can't believe how off on Jesus' message that group is. And then
Uh-huh.
you go further down the street to a mosque. The mosque would look at those two Baptist churches as being almost identical.
That's right.
Their arguments are so small that the mosque wouldn't be able to differentiate. So they'd be like, Jesus, yeah. Kingdom of heaven, yeah. And go on and on. And then what's the difference? Well, we believe. So I feel like Jesus, the way for him to articulate his differences is by having conversation with the Pharisees. The way to articulate his differences is because the Baptists in that town of Tennessee can't articulate their differences to the Muslims. It doesn't make sense. They're in a different world. But at least in the long term, we can say is Jesus only trying to appeal to Jews or the whole world, but in the long term, the real people they're appealing to is the bigger crowds, either Jews or the whole world. And those people didn't have these Pharisaic problems. The Pharisees, no matter how much, definitely were not representing everyone. They're always trying to represent their branch of Judaism or their version of Judaism. And I think the masses would have identified much more loosely with, I'm a Jew, I'm a Judean, I'm like, I do what I do. It's always a question how much people in the first century followed Pharisaic Judaism versus Sadducean Judaism versus Essene Judaism versus what probably most people followed, what their parents did Judaism.
Well, thank you for that distinction. Well, that is really helpful. These two churches down the street in Tennessee or in some remote part of the world, which they probably have the places where they differ, but in the external world, it's just one group. But I like what you're saying, where Jesus was using the group of Pharisees to explain his perspective, and so he was not so much undermining them, but as in he was propping them up to explain, here's how I differ from.
I'm not saying they're not the Antichrist from his perspective, but I'm saying they're the Antichrist as much as that Baptist church down the street in Tennessee is the Antichrist.
And so, okay, so with that background,
they're the ones who are leading you, but leading you astray. So he just wants better leaders.
So with that perspective, it feels like the group whom he undermined were the people or the crowds who were the ones he was trying to change, or he's trying to shape your thinking.
Yeah, I think this is what you do when you have the like what he viewed the Pharisees as. You would yell at the Pharisees so that the crowds could hear. Okay.
So in that case, right, wouldn't the Pharisees be the most blessed people because they were used as instruments of God by Jesus in whatever shape or form to help people attain enlightenment?
That's a big no to that one, Isaac.
Okay.
The Pharisees, just because you use a stake to stab someone doesn't mean that's an instrument of God. I would argue that there's many instruments of God, but no, big no to that. Okay, let's call it a day.
Okay, Rabbi, on that note, have a great Shabbos and talk to you next week. Thank you.